The purpose of this video is to extend the conversation that I began in the discussion about feudalism from a previous video, and to talk about what I think is the most important concept for understanding society in the Middle Ages, for understanding the relationships that existed between peoples of different ranks in medieval society. And this touches on politics, it touches even on culture to some extent. The concept in question is privilege. And so today, in the modern day, we think of people having rights. And to some extent, the idea of rights, natural rights, was put into place by thinkers during the Enlightenment. There are antecedents that go back to the Middle Ages and even to antiquity, that there is... So in some of the writings of Aristotle, for instance, there are some mention of things that nature endows people with, or at least that can be extrapolated from that. In the works of canon lawyers in the Middle Ages, we tend to see an advancement of some of that. But it's really with thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others during the Enlightenment period that we tend to see this become the basic assumption that informs people's legal status in the modern world and lies at the heart of, the creation or the recreation of democracy in the modern world. And all of that is to say that none of that existed in the Middle Ages. People did not conceive of themselves or others having rights, whether rights granted by someone or rights that were just part and parcel of them being human, as in the words of John Locke or later Thomas Jefferson, right? That we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That concept, the very notion that people had rights, simply did not exist in the Middle Ages. What did exist? Well, people conceived of themselves or others having privilege or not having privilege. Privilege was not something that was given by God. It was something that was given by an earthly authority. Someone who had power and status could grant privilege to another person or to a community of people. And so, for instance, monasteries had privilege. Nobles had privilege. Towns, in many cases, were able to extract privileges from nobles or from ecclesiastical authorities or others who could grant privileges. And kings and the Pope and others claimed divine power. Sometimes the term divine right is used. I'm just not sure that right is anything that is germane to the way things were actually described in the Middle Ages, right? And so ultimately the source of privilege is God, or at least that's how it was conceived. But privilege was granted by an earthly authority, okay? Now, in the High Middle Ages, literacy became much more important, and that just builds over time, right? The growth of that. And this is not to say that written documents were never used. We've talked about capitularies in the Carolingian period, and even written documents that go back to antiquity and late antiquity. But written documents become more important as containers of privilege. Right? If an authority granted a community or an individual privilege through a decree, over time these were written down, and the main genre of literature that contains these privileges or these documents are known as charters. And charters are some of the most common documents, written documents from the Middle Ages. Just to give you a sense of this, right, this is like my digital library, And almost all of these, there's so many of these, dozens of them are available in the public domain. You can get these on Google Docs. You can just download them. But you can see all of these cartularies, that means book of charters, that I have downloaded over time, right? Some of these are in French, and so you can see Cartulaire des Églises d'Autun, Cartulaire des l'évêque d'Autun, so the cartulary of the Church of Autun. Autun is a city in Burgundy in kind of eastern France, though it was an independent duchy in the Middle Ages. Cartulaire or Cartulary de l'évêque of the Bishop of Autun is what that says, okay? Then there are lots and lots of these, right? Many of these are monasteries. The Cartulary of Beaulieu, actually have this pulled up on this app here. Let's take a look at this real quick, right? So this is, I just turned to a page here, page 15 of the Cartulary of Beaulieu. So this is a monastery in France, okay? And you can see that the summary given of this charter by the editor of this, and this is in Latin, Privilegium Caroli Regis, privilege of Charles the King. This is not, by the way, Charlemagne, you may be wondering. Okay, you can see that this dates from the year 850. And so this is, I think, Charles the Fat. Or, no, actually 850, this would be Charles the Bald. I apologize. Charles the Fat is the son of Charles the Bald. So this is Charles the Bald, the king of West Francia, one of the participants in the Treaty of Verdun, which we talked about, okay. Concerning the immunity, de immunitate, Bellilocensi, which is Beaulieu, that's the Latin for Beaulieu, Cenobio Colata, Cenobio is the word for monastery, okay? Immunity is the important word here, right? This means that they are immune from certain taxes and certain requirements, obligations that people owed to the king, and Charles the Bald is granting them that immunity. And I could take you through the Latin and look at this, and a lot of this is very stylized. There's certain conventions that these charters follow. But the monastery kept this document and eventually made copies of it in this charter book because this was important for them. This determined their legal status. It demonstrated, it proved that they were privileged, that they did not owe the same taxes or other kinds of obligations that the common people who were not privileged owed to the king, that the king himself had granted this to them. And they kept it for a very, very long time, right? This happened in the year 850, but they preserved this document for centuries, right? And they could pull it out and demonstrate to any authority who might be trying to levy taxes against them or make them fulfill certain obligations that, look, we are immune from this. This is our privilege to be immune, okay? And so this is immunity is a common privilege granted, in this case by the king, but kings were not the only ones who could grant privilege. Dukes might grant privilege, counts might grant privilege, bishops or archbishops or the pope might grant privilege. Monasteries themselves might grant privilege to people who were their vassals or people who were under their stewardship or under their authority, okay? And so in medieval society, one or an individual or a community was either privileged or they were not privileged. And then, of course, there were the stipulations of the privileged. Someone who had privilege might be immune from taxes or obligations. They might have the ability to trade in certain places and in certain goods. They might have guarantees of protection from an authority like the king, who were granting the privilege to them. And so if they were threatened, they could call upon the one who granted them the privilege and say, we're being threatened, we need you to come and protect us, right? Whereas a person who did not have privilege had no recourse to such things. if they're being invaded, this is one of the reasons why the Peace of God movement gets going, right? And it becomes a kind of common peer pressure because the peasants were not privileged. And, people were raiding their grain stores and attacking them and raping their women and, burning their houses and things like that. And they had absolutely no recourse. They could not say, it is our right to exist and to have property, because those concepts didn't exist in the Middle Ages, okay? They didn't have privilege, and so they had no recourse to any authority to protect them from these things, at least until they, enter into these peace movements and force the hand of the authorities to stop fighting and to put pressure on those who were, pillaging and things like that. And notice that it's the privileged who are then put under the burden of protecting the common people. So hopefully that makes sense, right? And the reason that I bring this up is it underlies so many of the documents that I've assigned you for this course. We can take a look, for instance, at some of the readings in Geary, okay? And so the monastery of Cluny was one of the most important monasteries in the High Middle Ages. Its foundation dated back to the early 10th century. It was Count William of Burgundy, I believe, who founded the monastery itself. I'm not sure if this is William of Burgundy or William of Aquitaine. I think it's Burgundy. In any case, because Cluny is in Burgundy, so that makes sense. But we'll look at the foundation charter of Cluny, okay, and to try to determine the privileges that were given to Cluny. Now, I will bring up Cluny again when I talk about church reform, because Cluny is an important participant in church reform, specifically the reform of monasteries that happens during the High Middle Ages. But this here we have a good example of a grant of privilege ensconced in a charter, right? And so William, Count and Duke by the grace of God, diligently, so he's worried about the redemption of his soul. Okay, that's how this reads, right? So I, William, diligently pondering the salvation of my soul, desiring to provide for my own safety, he does not mean his physical safety, he means his spiritual safety, while I am still able, have considered it advisable, nay, most necessary, that from the temporal goods which have been conferred upon me, I should give some little portion for the gain of my soul, right? And so he then says, okay, I hand over from my own rule to the holy apostles, Peter, namely, and Paul, the possession. So he's giving these to the apostles, meaning he's handing this over to apostolic authority. You might think that's to the Pope, and to some extent it is, because the Pope is kind of the arbiter of this, right? And the Pope comes to have a special relationship with the monastery of Cluny. But he's handing this over to the church, or to the apostles Peter and Paul, the possessions over which I hold sway, the town of Cluny, namely with the court and demesne manor. And so this would be like the farmland that surrounds it, and all of the buildings that the Duke owns, and all of that, okay? And the church in honor of St. Mary, the Mother of God, and of St. Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, together with all the things pertaining to it, the vills, indeed the chapels, the serfs. So this contains not only land, but also the people who are tied legally to that land. That's what serfs are, okay? Of both sexes, the vines, the fields, the meadows, the woods, the waters, their outlets, the mills, the incomes, the revenues, what is cultivated and what is not, all in their entirety. And I give these things in the understanding that in Cluny, a regular monastery, meaning by regular he means one that has a rule, right? This is a cloistered monastery. So this isn't just a house for priests or secular clergy. We're talking about regular monks, meaning those who live by a rule, shall be constructed in honor of the holy apostles Peter and Paul, and that there the monks shall congregate and live according to the rule of St. Benedict, and that they shall possess, hold, and have and order those same things unto all time, right? And so this is a grant in perpetuity to eternity, right? Cluny will hold all of these things that I have decreed they will have, right? This whole community will be theirs, including the people who are serfs in that community, okay? That's the privilege. They possess this, free and clear of any obligations, taxes, any claims that the dukes or counts of Burgundy will have henceforth, right? They own these things in and of themselves. Okay, free and clear, we might say, right? So this privilege is about real estate and about everything that goes along with the real estate, including the serfs who live on the land. Okay. Now, others follow the example of William. That was in the year 910. Many of the nobles of that region and other regions began to give properties to Cluny, and this, this has to do with privilege because they come to have privileges over these lands that are granted, right? They own them free and clear, so to speak, and have the use of them. But I did want to note in this document, so this is the second charter. This is the charter of the Grossi family. This is another noble family who gave land to Cluny, right? We talked about how fief was the term everyone assumed was used universally across Europe to describe grants of land. We'll notice that the Grossi family gives an allode. This is a freeholding. So this is a one legal distinction about a piece of land. They also give a villa and a monsus, and then we go back to the term allode, right? Each of these had a legal meaning, and I don't want to split hairs and get into, what distinguishes a villa from a monsus, from an allode, from a fief, okay? But this is all to say that I talked about that infinite variation of, land and the kind of legal distinctions of ownership of land and things like that. You can see it at work here in this charter, okay? And again, like Duke William, they are giving it for the salvation of their souls and for the souls of their departed. So we already have a sense that people in this world can do things to enact the salvation of people who have passed on. So they say both living and dead, right? And this will get us into the topic of purgatory a bit later. We can already see evidence of that, okay? And the person, the Letbald, who is must be the knight of the Grossi family, he is giving this, and he says, I unbuckle the belt of war, cut off the hair of my head and beard for the divine love, and with the help of God, prepare to receive the monastic habit in the monastery of Cluny. And so not only is he giving land, but he himself was going to take up the monastic habit. He was going to become a monk, or at least a resident of Cluny, and put on the monastic garb. This was very common among nobles in the Middle Ages, that when they got late in life, as they're preparing to die, right, they had to do something for their salvation, they would give a grant of land and privileges that went along with that, and then they would take up the monastic habit and live out the last few years of their life in the monastery. In Latin, these are called grants ad succurrendum. The term ad succurrendum, if you know the word succor in English, right, succor, which means to aid, right? And so the idea there is ad succurrendum, this is a passive participle, for the succoring of my soul, right? For the aid of my soul. That's what these grants are called. Or that's a kind of rubric that we might think of to describe these sorts of charters that are, you give land, you go into the monastery, you do all of this for the salvation of your soul, but Cluny is the beneficiary, and they come to have privileges over these pieces of land and the serfs who live on them. Notice again, the serfs are mentioned here. Vineyards, buildings, fields, buildings, serfs of every sex and age, and so forth and so on, right? All of these things are given as part of the charter here. Privileges could be given to even in places where you might not think, right? So this is a charter from the second half of the 11th century. Specifically, I think the year 1084 is what this dates to. And this is the Bishop of Speyer, and so this is one of the cities along the Rhine, a major urban center in Western Germany. Rudiger Husmann, this is the Bishop of Speyer. He writes, when I made the villa of Speyer into a town, now notice that the bishop is the territorial lord of the town of Speyer, right? Speyer was an episcopal city, and so it's under the rule, both spiritual and temporal, of the bishop. So when I made the villa of Speyer into a town, I thought that I would increase the honor I was bestowing on the place if I brought in the Jews. Therefore, now, so the Jews are the ones receiving a privilege here. This is a charter given to the Jews of that city, right? And Bishop Rudiger says, I invited Jews to this town because I knew that they would add to the economy. Jews were well connected. They had trade contacts all over Europe. They had money. And as part of the privileges that he's granting them, okay, he says, among other things, right, let's see, I have granted also them to them within the district where they dwell, and from that district outside the town as far as the harbor, and within the harbor itself, full power to change gold and silver. And so they become money changers, right? And to buy and sell what they please. So this is, mercantile privileges that they're being granted. And I've also given them license to do this throughout the state, meaning, the surrounding region of Speyer. So not just in the city, but in the whole countryside around it. Besides this, I have given them land of the church for a cemetery with rights of inheritance. According to Jewish law, Jews had to bury their dead in a separate cemetery from non-Jews, right? And so the Jews themselves would have insisted on this, and it seems the Jews had a good deal of input into this privilege. This also I have added, that if any Jew should at any time stay with them, he shall pay no felony. This is a tax that was charged for foreigners who were visiting the city. Why would he do this? Well, obviously, if a Jew is visiting, he's probably coming with commerce into the city, and so you want to make sure that he doesn't have to pay to do business here. This is going to increase the economic vitality of the city of Speyer. And he also says that the chief rabbi will be the one to hear cases which arise between Jews or against them, and so he's granting judicial privilege to the religious leaders of the Jewish community. He says even that they can employ nurses and servants from among our people, and so Christians can enter their employ. That's part of the privilege as well. And he says some other things that have to do with requirements of Jewish law, that that they are granted privileges to make sure that the slaughtered meat, which they may not eat, which means a meat that's slaughtered not in a kosher way. And rabbis would check this very closely to make sure that it was kosher. If the meat turns out is not kosher, then they can go and sell that to Christians, and Christians may lawfully buy that, right? And so this privilege gets really specific. And over time, privileges do get really complex. There's a charter granted to the Jews of Austria from 1244, I believe it is, from the Duke of Austria. And this thing has 70 different, stipulations that are part of the privilege. This is 11th century. It's still fairly simple. They get more elaborate over time, right? So Jewish communities were often privileged. In fact, this is how Jews were able to exist in Christian Europe. They extracted privileges from the authorities in exchange for providing, services that helped to boost the commerce of cities like Speyer. I did want to look really briefly at one other document, a couple other documents here, actually, right? So one of the assignments this week, or the major assignment, of course, is to look at the Galbert of Bruges. Now, I realize this is in the Geary. This is only an excerpt from that, and it's not the same translation as the one we're using, right? We're using the Jeff Ryder translation. But this is from an older translation, okay? That's the murder of Charles the Good is very intimately connected with privilege. Because the Arenbalds, right, the ones who murdered him, were nobles. But why were they on the outs with Charles? Why did they reach the point where they want to murder him? Well, as we've discussed already in some lectures, and as you will notice really quickly as you're reading this text, he was trying to take away their privilege. He had decreed, or had found out, right? It says accidentally, but one wonders how accidental it really was. He had found out that they were actually serfs. This was a power play. This was all about taking away their privilege. If somebody is legally unfree, they cannot hold privilege. And the Arenbalds were not going to take this lying down, right? This was a terrible thing for them. This would have meant the destruction of their family. It would have meant that they were subject to all sorts of obligations to the count, that they would lose what they had achieved, kind of the rank of nobility they had achieved. And even though in some places serfs could live a fairly privileged life, okay, like the ministerials in Germany, for instance. In this case, they were really scared that this would completely undermine everything their family had achieved. Now, there's a good deal more you can do with that text, right? I mean, there's talk about the Crusades. There's talk about ideas of holiness. Charles is portrayed as nearly being a saint. There are a lot of different directions you can take that paper, but I would encourage you to pay attention to privilege and the role that privilege plays in this document, or in this story about the murder of Charles the Good, right? And so I think I'll leave it there, right? You might also notice in some of these other sources, and so, these ones that describe agreements between lords and vassals, okay, this is William of Aquitaine and this knight named Hugh, that he grants him privileges, but then he takes them away, right? These seem to be violations. And Hugh is so fed up with this that he dictates all of these, underhanded things that William did, right? That the Count of Aquitaine did to him. We, of course, don't have the other side of the story. We have to trust that Hugh was telling the truth, and maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, okay? But this also is a document that demonstrates the limits of privilege, we might say, right? That it seems that William of Aquitaine was willing to go against the privileges that he had granted if it was politically advantageous for him. And so he grants Hugh lands and privileges, and then, he sees another opportunity to make a powerful friend. And so he strips Hugh of those privileges and gives the land to somebody else. And Hugh just kind of can do nothing about this. And eventually, the document reaches the point where, William is like, well, look, I'm going to grant you a privilege here, but you've got to desist from, all of these claims you're making against me that I violated our agreements before. Okay. Give up all, the Count says to Hugh, give up all those claims of over which you have quarreled with me in the past, and swear fidelity to me and my son, and I will give you your uncle's honor or something else of equal value in exchange for it. In other words, I will give you another privilege, but just forget that, I violated these agreements, basically. Give up these claims you've made, and I'll give you something of equal value. And it seems that Hugh can do little else, right? He's like, look, I know you are a trickster. I know you have tried to screw me over in the past, but he ultimately agrees with this, right? Under the terms of such an agreement, the Count and his son should render fidelity to Hugh with no evil intentions. Hugh became their vassal, and they had Hugh abandon everything which he had claimed from the past, and he swore fidelity to them again, right? And so it seems that, and I don't know if Hugh was just a sucker, that he was willing to kind of go through this again, but we don't have the rest of the story to know if this turned out well for Hugh. Okay, so that document is also all about privilege, and we can see how fraught these relationships and this issue itself could be in the Middle Ages. Okay. All right, I think I'm going to leave the conversation there, but you always have to keep in mind... Oh, one other thing I wanted to say about this, sorry. Privilege was often solidified by ritual. We talked about the feudal relationship where someone would swear fealty to someone else, and there was this ritual where the person would kneel before his lord, put his hands in the prayer gesture. The Lord would then put his hands on the outside of the hands of the vassal, and that when there would be witnesses and all of this, okay? We can see that all over these documents, right? William the Count, so, here at the beginning of the document, okay? William, Count of the Aquitanians, had an agreement with Hugh the Chiliarch to the effect that when Viscount Rosso dies, he, that is William the Count, would give him his honor and commendation. And so they made an agreement, and then it says, Roho the bishop, Roho, that's a great word, the bishop saw and heard this, and he kissed the arm of the Count. And you're like, why is he kissing the Count's arm? Well, that's part of the ritual, to solidify the relationship, and the bishop is present, so he can testify that this happened, right? And why did he kiss his arm? Well, seeing someone kiss someone else is a memorable thing. kissing is often involved in the rituals, right? And I mean, if you know the Catholic liturgy, you'll know there's a moment where there's like a kiss of peace or a declaration of peace, right? I mean, this is supposed to be memorable, supposed to be something that you witness, okay? And so, one person kissing another person would be witnessed by these people. They could say, yes, I saw him kiss his arm. And so therefore, the agreement they made is valid, right? So there's a ritualized aspect to this. One of the things that you might note from the Galbert reading is that at one point, the Arambalds, as they're plotting the murder of Count Charles, they find this young nobleman named Robert. He's called Robert the Boy. And they try to make him swear allegiance to them, that he will go through with the plans that they're making. And they won't tell him what those plans are. And he's like, no, tell me what I'm agreeing to. And they're like, no, you just need to agree to this, right? And so this is like ritualized treason. They are trying to undermine the obligations that Robert has to Count Charles and essentially claim him as their vassal, right? And if they can get him to swear to this oath, then he effectively becomes their vassal. And people took these oaths very, very seriously, especially if there was a ritual aspect to the swearing of the oath, right? So here we are in a very different world from the world we live in. The Middle Ages is often very strange, and here are some really good examples of the strangeness that we see in a lot of these medieval documents, okay? If you have questions, bring them up on the discussion board. Let's talk about them in the live session or whatever, but privilege is an absolutely vital thing that you have to understand to make sense of the Middle Ages.